Well, good morning. Good to be with you again. It seems like we had some major technological problems yesterday with the internet and with us uploading part one of the sermon from yesterday, Palm Sunday sermon. And so I thought what I'll do quickly for you this morning is just give you a very brief outline really of what part one was about, just so you can get the right context for the ending of part two of that sermon from Mark chapter 15, verse 1 to 15, where the Jewish leadership, in a way, bring Jesus before Pilate. They need to get rid of him, and so they use nefarious means, if I could use that term, to get rid of him. And so part two really dealt with the end of that sermon, the part where the crowds reject Jesus and they begin to shout, "Crucify him," and ultimately Jesus is led to his death, to the cross at Calvary. And so I just wanted to give you an update, so you have part one that goes with it. And so really, where we find ourselves in chapter 15. In chapter 14, we would have seen that the Jewish leaders, the elders, the teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin, all of them had come together and they'd held an illegal court. And they really needed to get rid of Jesus. And so they held this court late at night under the cover of darkness. They hold this court to try and find some fault in Jesus that they can use to get rid of him, ultimately to kill him. See, Jesus has become a major threat to their way of life. Jesus is, in a way, in his new teaching, in his new religion, if we could use that term, that he's preaching, they are losing control and they are losing power over people. So if you can control them with religion, then you have ultimate power over them. And what Jesus is teaching is going to rob them of that power. It's going to diminish their power. And so they hold this court and they legally condemn Jesus to death. Now, the Sanhedrin have the power to condemn people to death, but they do not have the power or the authority to actually carry out and the sentence. And so, number one, they have this illegal court, and number two, they bring in witnesses who lie, because it says in chapter 14 that the statements of the witnesses did not tie up. They didn't substantiate each other, didn't corroborate the different stories. And so this whole court is illegal. Everything they do is illegal, but they need to do something to legitimize their illegitimate court. That's what they need to do. And so for them, the problem is that Jesus is a theological problem. He's a religious problem. And there's not much they can do about that. So what they have to do is in some way twist the whole story that Jesus becomes a government problem, not just a church problem in a way, if we say that, but he becomes a government problem. So he's no longer a Jewish problem, but he has to become a Roman problem. And so they need to do something. And chapter 14 actually reads in verse 1 of chapter 14 of Mark, says, the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and to get rid of him. See, they had to use underhanded means. They couldn't come with any legitimate reason before the Roman government to present Jesus to them that would get the Romans to do anything against Jesus. And so they had to come up with a way of making Jesus a government problem, a legal problem, not just a spiritual problem. So Mark chapter 15, we see them actually getting this right, where they bring Jesus before Pilate early in the morning. It says very early, so possibly between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. They've got to get to the governor before he starts his normal day of business. But again, it's just this whole context that we see of everything is done under the cover of darkness. Everything is done, it's almost hidden away from public eye so that people can't see that. And so part of this is now they've got to take Jesus's the way they've convicted him of blasphemy, and they've got to make it a government problem. And so right at the beginning, we see Jesus being rejected by the leaders of the synagogue. Jesus being rejected by the Jewish leadership. And ultimately, if we put it in today's terms, we see Jesus being rejected by leadership of the church, if we want to break it down in today's times. And I don't see any difference from then to now. When I look at some of the churches and the theologies and the doctrines we're having preached now, Jesus is also a threat. The truth and the simplicity of the gospel is also a threat to today's times. For many of the leaders of the church, to preach just the truth of Jesus is a problem. You see, if we preach just Jesus and the gospel, very often we're going to lose our prestige, we're going to lose our popularity, we're going to lose our power, and right at the depth of it all, we're going to lose our income. We're going to lose all this money that has been brought into many churches through the preaching of a false doctrine, of a false gospel. And so when we preach something that is only Jesus, Jesus becomes a threat to us as well. And that's what was happening for these guys. You see, if we preach a gospel where we are the hero, we have a problem. And many preachers are doing that today. We become the hero in the story. And I want to say to you, ultimately, Jesus is the hero of the gospel and we are the villains. We are not the heroes, we are the villains in the story of the gospel and in the truth of the gospel. And for them, for many years, they'd been the heroes, not the villains. And now, ultimately, we see as they bring Jesus before Pilate that they actually are the villains. And so they twist everything. They reject Jesus. They reject him for what he is, for who he is, for what he's teaching. They bring him before Pilate. Pilate is not a nice guy in any way whatsoever. History would tell us that he was really incompetent, very self-seeking, wanted to build his own empire in a way, was more worried about his own power and his own prestige and his own coffers, his own bank balance than he was really about the people that he was governing. And ultimately, I don't know how true this is. History says that he was removed from power and banished and ultimately committed suicide. I don't know any of that, if that is true or how it worked out. All I know is that he was not a good leader, not a good man, quite weak, a little bit of a coward. And so he gets manipulated, and he is a manipulator. He's a political being. They bring him before Pilate. Pilate questions him. Ultimately, he says, I know in his heart, he says, I know that this man is innocent. When he asks him the questions, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answers him, he knows this man is innocent. But the passage says to us that the leadership just keep bringing more and more accusations against him. It says, we found this man misleading our nation. Luke 23, his version of the story. We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is the Christ, the king. And that becomes the major problem. See, that is what they use to stop Jesus from being just a religious issue for them to becoming a government issue for the Roman leadership. The moment they say Jesus stops us from giving tribute to Caesar, he stops us from bringing any kind of worship of Caesar in there, there's a problem, number one. And to give tribute, part of that was to give into the finances of the Roman government. And so straight away, when they do this and they mislead and they lie about Jesus, he becomes a Roman problem, because now he's become a problem in filling their coffers. He's become a problem in saying that he is the king and not Caesar. And that was a problem for them at that time. And so we see the leadership ultimately rejecting Jesus, and we see them placing him before Pilate with lies around his authority and around his divinity. And that's when we see Pilate coming in and questioning him and saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus very wisely answers, yes, as you say I am. And so ultimately what he's really doing is putting the ball back into Pilate's court. And he's not saying, yes, I am the king, because straight away he would have given Pilate license to have him executed. What he's saying is, yes, it is as you say. And so he puts the ball back into Pilate's court. And Pilate really is caught then between a rock and a hard place, in a very difficult position, because Jesus hasn't incriminated himself. And so he finds himself, Pilate, having to work the system in some way, because he knows that Jesus is innocent, but he's stuck between the Jewish leadership, and he's stuck between the rules and the laws of the country that he has to uphold as well. And if Jesus is claiming to be king, then he's usurping Caesar's throne, and if he's failing to allow them to give tribute, then he's stopping the money from coming in, and ultimately he's becoming a political nightmare for Pilate. And so Pilate has to act on this. And then I think we'll see from there, as we went into part 2, that by now the leadership of the church in a way have rejected Jesus. Now Pilate, the governor, the leader of the Romans, has also rejected Jesus because he doesn't know what to do with him. And so Pilate then manipulates the whole system, as we see in part 2, to get the crowds in a way to make the decision. So ultimately he could wash his hands of the whole situation, as we'll read. If you want to go to the versions of Luke and of John, you'll see ultimately he washes his hands of the whole thing, and he says they need to make the decision. And so he doesn't take any responsibility for the decision that comes. Ultimately he hands Jesus back over again. And so that sort of in a nutshell was what was going on in part 1. And so I hope that as you have listened to part 2, this will now give you some clarity as to where we found ourselves in part 1. And so again, blessings for the day. Enjoy your day today. Be safe.